Hey, what's up, America? It's Patrick Lovell, Truth Bomb riffing on. I think it's Tuesday, right? Or is it Wednesday? I think it's Wednesday. Wednesday, August 2nd, 2023 at approximately 1 p.m. my time. Good day to you all. I hope this world finds you well, and I hope that your families are well. I hope that you're healthy. I hope that you haven't had any catastrophic information in your life today. I know millions of you will inevitably, just because that's the life, c'est la vie. But in all honesty, I think we're all quite aware that the United States is in a death spiral. But I got to tell you, from where I'm sitting, there's still hope to be able to take over controls of the cockpit and pull us out of our death spiral and fly to glory. And quite frankly, the only way that's going to happen is if millions of you, probably tens of millions of you, listen to what I'm telling you and vector into understanding who I am in this whole situation. And I know I have to pause sometimes because I sound like such a guy I don't want to sound like, quite frankly, when I say declarative statements like that, but it's true. So who am I? I'm a muckraking journalist. I'm an independent producer that put together all of the elements and unpacked the largest criminal conspiracy and cover up in history that never ended. That the system that's in complete control, quite frankly, given all of the chaos that's out there, you're probably thinking to yourself, nobody has control. Oh, yeah, they do. And who is they? Well, I'll get to that. But I want to start with what's on everybody's mind, which is, of course, all things Donald Trump, which is, look, I mean, I guess it's fun to watch to a certain degree, right? But at the same time, it's going to, I hope, if I deliver this in a, I don't know, in a reasonable way that's paced in a way that you can actually understand, then hopefully we can solve this riddle that has been befuddling the American people for a very long time. So let's just start with Donald Trump. And where does each case stand? I mean, look, last night, more indictments came down by the special prosecutor Jack Smith, which of course we're seeing all over social media, particularly if you follow Twitter, which I'll say is a platform that I believe is like 3.0 Cambridge Analytica, Mercer, Russian bot hate madness of 2016 on nuclear steroids, probably funded by right-wing billionaires. If Dominion was able to get $787 million from Fox for their atrocious lies as it relates to the January 6th insurrection, then, what is going on Twitter? I can count and just watch probably thousands of lies and libel in the span of an hour. If I want to spend that long, I could probably document, categorize, and go through. And and I think that these vectors on Twitter are literally bots. I think they're bots that are written, they're programmed, because I know how to do the written programming stuff because the option is available to me as a blue check mark, and I pay right on Twitter, or I should say, sorry, X. And as I happened to mention earlier today, I wonder every time I enter the website now that it's X, it feels like I'm entering, not to say from experience, but it feels like I'm entering one of those adult websites that you shouldn't be. And I wonder how many of you are looking over your shoulder at work because you're going into X and it looks awfully, questionable, right? And it is, quite frankly, questionable. And I'm sure there's a lot of you out there that are questionable, that say things that you'd never say in public, but that you're not afraid to say on X because it's like, you're in the closet, like Donald Trump described some 800-pound guy, doing some sort of blogging from his bedroom. I think Trump mentioned that in 2016, which was pretty funny, actually. And every once in a while, Trump makes me really laugh. But I'm really laughing at the fact that he's going down for a crime against the United States of America that the United States is demonstrating in all of its facets, all of the criminal ways that Donald Trump has broken the law. And he's going to be he's indicted for it, but now it's going to go through the whole process and then trial. And the one thing that's going to be really, really fascinating to me is the fact that where in any part of the country will you find an entire jury that isn't made of one Trump fanatic supporter. Honestly, I mean, it's like, I think they're just there naturally, let alone all of the shenanigans behind the scenes when you pick the jury and, find somebody that'll be on the jury. And, will we be in a situation like the O.J. Simpson trial where everybody thought he was guilty, and he probably was. And after this many years later, it certainly looks like it, but he got away because the jury was sick and tired of the LAPD and their, systemic predation and targeting of minorities. And so they weren't going to let the man get away with taking down one of their own, is really what it came down to in the OJ trial. And of course, OJ ended up bankrupt, and they get him in the civil litigation many years downstream, and his life was not easy. And then he wound up in jail for 10 years. Is he still in jail? I think he got released a while ago. Hard to keep up with all of these different kind of salacial trials. But let's kick it off with Trump real quick. And, look, yesterday, the big proclamation that drove, all of the right and Republicans and MAGA's head on fire is the fact that here's this one sum total charge that Donald Trump defrauded the United States of America. There was an interesting sort of corollary in what Jack Smith did, because Jack Smith doesn't have to prove that Donald Trump was the brains of the operation, that he created it and then executed it and then everything that came with it. I never thought Donald Trump was. I always thought that Donald Trump was in one of these wag the dog scenarios where he was basically reading from a script, and then they throw him in front of the cameras and a teleprompter, and I'll never forget that look on his face on January 6th, like he was the conductor while everybody was, storming the Capitol. And I'll never forget also watching media in live, in real time, saying nobody saw this coming. And it was like, oh my God, what am I reliving 9/11? Nobody saw it coming. It was online every day for like the previous 3 weeks, where MAGAs from all over the country were, culminating in Washington, D.C. They were partying down at Trump's Washington, D.C. hotel, for Christ's sakes. They weren't hiding it, and everybody knew they were there, and they came from all over the country, and nobody asked questions. Now, that's really intriguing, quite frankly, and I'm not going to go into the Joe Rogan, like, oh, yeah, it was a false flag operation, and, the inside guys, let it happen because they wanted to take down Donald Trump. Oh, yeah, like Donald Trump just walked into that one. Would it be plausible that there's a right-wing billionaire apparatus that wants to take control of this country and has since Jim Birch Society in the 50s, and they saw an opportunity to be able to do it? And oh yeah, maybe if Donald Trump were in the mix, he probably would pull out of his, his what do we call it when you have a quiver, right? Of his quiver of, tricks up his sleeve that ultimately, he didn't pull from what he knew from the great financial crisis and his own fraud and his own business dealings and everything else to come up with some of the things that I'm going to lay on you. But let's just kind of talk about the cases for a second. So in context to Donald Trump defrauding the United States of America and using violence or exploiting violence to steal the election from you and me, right? Those of us who weren't voting for Donald Trump, they literally stole the election from us, which, as it turns out, is illegal. Now, by the way, are any of us naive to think enough, given gerrymandering over the last 20 years and probably all sorts of tricks going back, I don't know, to at least the 50s that I'm aware of, that there wasn't some sort of like approximation of, people influencing, people in districts to vote a specific way, and if they didn't, they could make their lives hard for them. That sort of racketeering, or quite frankly, redistricting it in a way through this gerrymandering business to where it's like, oh yeah, they were stealing votes in elections all day, every day, because both parties, but particularly the Republicans, way more savvy at this than the Democrats. And I've learned over the course of the last many years, they got all this stuff from the Jim Crow era, because boy, are they deviant. Which I'll plant this in your head as it relates to sharecropping by way of what ultimately happened in the 2008 great financial crisis. It never ceases to amaze me that all of these tricks and these tools that these like unbelievably diabolical villains have access to have been a part of the playbook for, in some cases, centuries, literally. But I don't want to go into all of that scenario because let's just stick with the task at hand. So obviously, MAGA went absolutely nuts, and Donald is in the midst of at least 4 separate criminal investigations at the state and the federal levels. and also related to his business and his political choices. Now, interestingly enough, the business stuff I'll put on the back end of this, which I believe have the most telling aspects of who Donald Trump actually is that stand the test of decades in the making, quite frankly, but ultimately that are part of this, but not a part of where we're all kind of looking in the moment. So, first of all, think about the investigation into the January 6th and the 2020 election inquiry through Jack Smith's investigation. That's done a number of things, including the criminal fraud exception, which has put Donald Trump's attorneys on notice that there is evidence that they have lied to the court on behalf of their client, Donald Trump, which is, what Donald Trump's attorneys always do. And what was the whole thing behind, get me my Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was a master of this stuff back in the 50s and ultimately was working with J. Edgar Hoover and deep stuff back in the day. And then ultimately, gets hired on board the Trump world and is deeply enmeshed with everything that Donald Trump came up with, through the 70s and the 80s, and taught him never to apologize, never to admit anything, sue, delay, and all of those different tactics. And that's, of course, what Donald Trump's done, to the tune of keeping him out of prison for decades when he should have been imprisoned probably in the 70s, quite frankly. But the bottom line is him not being in prison, particularly after the SNL crisis, is just yet another sort of question mark as to why suddenly the full sort of legal apparatus of the United States is revealing their cards of what's illegal and bringing all of these charges against Donald Trump. So, of course, in addition to the top secret clearance and him taking things that he knew that he didn't have access to or the right to, and he did anyway, and then he lied about it, and then he hid it, and then against the subpoenas used, his underlings, like probably, I'm just projecting because I don't know the details of what seems to be a Mexican-American guy that, was working at Mar-a-Lago that just took orders from the boss to sabotage evidence that was down there and drain the pool and all of that sort of thing. And I don't know the details on that, but it's just, part of the, the whole Trump griftopia universe. But he's busted and he admitted it to what he did. And now he's selling the Trumpers like, yeah, I broke the law. So I admit to it. I mean, to a degree, part of and then they start enmeshing all of this stuff into free speech. But meanwhile, the case based on the legal, parameters of what's going on has proved not only that Donald Trump's attorneys are lying, that Donald Trump took top secret clearance information that he didn't have access to, and he did so against the will of the actual law itself. Who knows what kind of top clearance secrets that he had down there. There's been a lot of speculation that he was selling, our plans for nuclear attack, I guess, against Iran to Saudi Arabia and that sort of thing. But who knows? I think it was potentially a lot worse than that. And I guess the only time will tell if we get that information. But in either case, because this is in West Palm Beach and the presiding judge is Judge Eileen Cannon, then there's been a whole lot of groundswell about, well, wait a second, is Judge Eileen Cannon compromised because she was chosen by Trump? Because you can just look at the actions that she makes to delay, given the information of what the Department of Justice has. Is she actually part of sort of a resistance on behalf of Trump to prevent getting a trial of this magnitude, given, state secrets and everything else that, is important for national security, not to mention, the actual governance of this nation to, for example, if she postpones the trial and kicks the can down the road. So all of the experts, particularly Lawrence Tribe from Harvard University, has impugned the integrity of Judge Eileen Cannon over and over. So set those two things aside, in addition to everything else that we're looking at. So then there's the further election inquiry into Georgia as it relates to the efforts for Mr. Trump to reverse the election loss in Georgia. And as it turns out, all the speculation at the moment is DA Fani Willis in Atlanta is going to bring racketeering, influence, corrupt organization charges against Trump's apparatus that I believe also involves Rudolph Giuliani, ironically, who was the guy who brought us RICO back in the 70s when he actually was a good guy taking on the five mobs families of New York, of which, by the way, Donald Trump was heavily involved with many of his building projects in Manhattan, because as it turns out this many years later, we know that you couldn't get anything done in Manhattan unless you were dealing with the five families and all of their, kind of periphery through, whatever the unions were and are, as well as Teamsters and that sort of thing. And, that goes back to the 50s. So extraordinary sort of dynamics at play here, that spans the time of decades. Now, the third case is the, as I mentioned, the classified documents case and everything that deals with. And then, of course, so far, the Manhattan criminal case and the hush money payments to a porn star, which I always thought was hilarious given, the nature of Watergate and Deep Throat. But, the long and the short of that is it was so, in retrospect, so easy for the Trump administration, or the Trump apparatus to basically, because of the nature of Citizens United and dark money antics, they didn't have to frickin' just go directly paying checks directly to the people that they were working with. There were so many ways they could have configured things that they didn't, and it just reflects that Donald Trump's apparatus are a bunch of frickin' buffoons, a couple of morons, which held together completely when you look at the crimes that Donald Trump is being charged with. Not to mention, of course, and I think this might be the most important one, is the documentation fraud case in the elector certifications to try to swing the electoral college, that ultimately now it looks like Pence is being kind of propped up as the hero that, actually stayed true to, the apparatuses of his position as vice president, not to mention, I guess, and what's the word I'm looking for? Basically not sabotaging or betraying the Constitution. Okay, so there's that. Trust me, in my world, Mike Pence will never be a hero, but I stopped way short of hanging him like the January 6th insurrection guys wanted to do. And I think they got within 40 feet of him, man. So I guess in some way, it was pretty heroic of Mr. Fly on his forehead. Was it a fly? During the debates with I guess, Kamala Harris. Yeah, the vice presidential debates. You remember the fly that was on his forehead? That was really peculiar. But look, you take the sum total of these scenarios, and then you add what nobody's talking about at the moment, but I think are the most telling of all of the investigations into Donald Trump and all of the indictments yet to come are going to come out of the New York AG's office as it relates to Donald Trump's business practices over the course of decades, including, of course, all of the award-winning work that the New York Times did on him evading taxes and what that means and all of the rest of it, because that's part and parcel to what we call control fraud and the appraisal fraud and the insurance fraud and the Machiavellian maneuverings of where it's like, hey, we're going to maximize. And like literally in Donald Trump's case, it's so idiotic, it's unbelievable. But like quadruple the space of a penthouse and like double the cost of the square footage, which of course is easy to tell based on the appraisals in the neighborhood and everything else. And he just highly inflated, both the size and the value square footage of his penthouse in Manhattan and buildings and all sorts of other things that he used to get loans. That's the whole purpose. You hyperinflate your assets to get loans as a part of a control fraud in which ultimately he pays himself, basically screws everybody else, which is his business practices forever on top of everything he did with his casino up in Taj Mahal during the SNL crisis, which was at that time was actually linked to Michael Milken and the whole racketeering stuff that was going on, with junk bonds, which funded the whole thing. And that's part of what's control fraud. But there's like 200 cases that are involved with that. And so what we're looking at in terms of this apparatus is that the full legal apparatus of the United States, from the Department of Justice through all of the things in the investigations that were floated this direction by the FBI. And we're not hearing too much about the FBI, which is intriguing to me, especially given who stood down during January 6th. And I know that Joe Rogan's like, it's a false flag, operation. Bullshit. Maybe there was a few in there, but it wasn't everybody. Who knows? I mean, we could debate that later. But the bottom line is, the biggest question of all about January 6th, as far as I'm concerned, considering it's fucking Washington, D.C., surrounded by more military, it's insane. And the Pentagon and the biggest military in the world could mobilize not just the National Guard, but probably, whatever version of military special ops and everything else to get rid of MAGA in a span of like seconds if they chose to. Think about it. If there were a bunch of black guys waving, Black Lives Matter or, some sort of like, I don't know, Malcolm X type of flag, how long would they have been in front of the Capitol before they sent the troops in? It'd have been like that. Okay, so MAGA, that didn't happen, the insurrection, not to mention the fact that there were police and there were special ops guys. There were all sorts of military guys that were a part of MAGA that, charged the freaking Capitol and everything that came off since. And I swear to God, I'm looking at this whole thing. Nobody is genius enough, not even the CIA, okay, to pull off this whole thing as a false flag information. Unless, of course, this is the only thing I'll play on that level, is if, Donald Trump was from the very beginning some sort of Manchurian candidate. That's the only thing that would make sense. And trust me, I know the CIA has done this kind of stuff all over the world. And so would they orchestrate this on behalf? Well, how would the right-wing billionaires who are involved with Saudi Arabia and oil and all of the military industrial benefit from, playing both sides? I guess that rhetorically because I don't have the answers. I don't think they would. I think they were all in on the insurrection. I think they were all in on trying to create a coup d'etat, and they were all in on it because, and this is my ultimate theory, okay? Donald Trump's been defrauding the United States for decades. What he has done through control fraud, which I didn't learn until I produced my work, The Con, at www.thecon.tv, which turned out to be like this sort of like, I don't know, magic, there's this sort of like this knowledge that nobody understands, and I never understood it because it took the 2008 great financial crisis for me to ask the right questions. Look, I've always believed in the integrity of law in the United States. I've always believed in the integrity of the professionals that we elect, whether Republican or Democrat, that when they battle over policy descriptives and maybe international sort of scenarios and combat and all that kind of stuff. Okay, fine. But I would always like almost in a Jack Ryan kind of way that the intelligence community gives the right information to the professionals that make the right decisions, and they are on a special sort of plane because they were elected, they're professionals, they're the smartest amongst us, all of those types of things that would give them the sort of, I'd say, credibility, leverage, the opportunity to do things on behalf of the United States that we, the people, don't have all the information, so we can't make all that information. So you kind of just have the faith that the guys in control are going to do it on within the parameters of the Constitution, and also within the parameters of everything that made us what we were or are, based on what 246 years of evolution from the American Revolution all the way through. You got to take all of this stuff in a continuum, right? But the real continuum that you've got to be aware of, and what I'm trying to reveal to you, because we're seeing this like explosion, this nauseating foment of hatred, of these lies that are coming through these vectors, particularly on Twitter, that are like, so easy, they're elementary to blow up, and yet they're just coming at us left and right with no end in sight, and they're trying desperately to say that it's Donald Trump that got set up, which is freaking ridiculous, and it's the easiest trick in the book. Like I've mentioned on many of these truth bombs, I learned that trick when I was in my fraternity, which is to lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate. And if you have any knowledge of law, stay quiet, because that's how people call someone who gives up the beans because they're making a deal with the DA or the prosecutor or anything else the rat, because they're saving themselves, right? Meanwhile, the way I look at it, all the people that are in on the criminal activity to begin with are the fucking rats, and all of the criminals, cockroaches, that are like always complicit in some sort of outcome that is antithetical to what character and dignity and integrity of the law demands. So ultimately, we're looking at all of these charges that have got the oxygen of the entire country, probably world. Is he innocent? Is he guilty? It sets the tone for the next 18 months of this carnage that's going to continue to play out between is the law going to be able to move fast enough to be able to stop Donald Trump in his tracks, or maybe even send him to prison before the election? Or is it going to go to the election and tens of millions of people are going to show up potentially that are buying the lies? Because as Lawrence Tribe said last night, that there is, such a distrust in the nation for our institutions that nothing matters. That whatever they say doesn't matter. That they've lost their credibility, so it doesn't matter. So let's, so they don't care if a lying scumbag cheater that, is destroying everything that matters about the rule of law in the United States. They'll be like, you know what, but he's our guy. He's our pig, right? I mean, that's how it works within criminal apparatus. It's like, yeah, we know of all of the bad guys that exist, but he's our bad guy, right? I mean, that's been in all the big boroughs of New York and Boston and Chicago and all the big cities forever. I mean, that's kind of how it works with the mob, okay? And is Don a mob boss? Yeah, in many ways he kind of is. I think he played a little bit, skated on thin ice a long time, and it all now catching up. But here's the long and the short of it. What he did to the United States, what he's doing to the United States, what the United States is demonstrating that he is in the crosshairs of a dragnet because of all of these different criminal crimes, especially and most notably trying to steal an election from everybody else who votes peaceably and everything else that gives the freedom of our government to us. And in the vacuum of that, given all the cheating scenarios, what does that mean? Well, it means it's creating an autocracy or some sort of dictatorship or some sort of strongman scenario that millions and millions of people are backing. Now, is this the first time in history that that's happened? No, of course not. Does anybody understand World War II? I do. I can tell you a lot about Mussolini and fascism. I can tell you a lot more about the Third Reich and Hitler. Do I think Donald Trump is Hitler? Fuck no. Donald Trump's nowhere near the unfortunate flamboyance and, charisma and architecture and engineering of all of the things in artistry that, and I'm not trying to give Hitler any props here, trust me. I think Hitler should have been taken out, long before all of the madness of World War II took place. But the long and the short of it is the complicity of the German people is the big question here, because they all knew what was going on. And they all gladly got in line because they knew if they didn't, they'd get killed. Which ultimately fascism and fascists are made up in the end after you get rid of the first, few waves that are the diehard believers. They're cowards, okay? And that's the way it was in World War II in the United States, because we fought for our principles of liberty and dignity and justice, even though we had plenty of problems, especially with Jim Crow, and our African-American soldiers showed so much courage in World War II for a country that treated them like garbage. But that's part and parcel to the evolution of the United States. But what does all of this mean in terms of why I'm riffing about Donald Trump defrauding the United States? Well, because, guys, as guilty as he is, as a pig face, as a treasonous bastard, as a guy that should be shot for treason, in my opinion, or hung, which is what they would have done in the old days, he's still a tiny piece of the puzzle of what the government, most notably our financial system, and notice how I said it in that order because I accidentally, that's a mistake, but it's almost like did I say that out loud? Because it was the financial system that now owns our government that did the exact same thing to tens of millions of people and then got away with tens of trillions of dollars while the media covered it up, the government covered it up, and the judiciary bulldozed millions of people illegally. So let me hit the rewind button. What did they do? What did the financial sector do illegally? Watch The Con. www.thecon.tv. So back in 2008, 9, 10, I've been a producer for over 2 decades ultimately. Now over 2 decades, then subtract a decade, right? And ultimately, I was in the business of giving away free houses for a television show all over the United States, and shit went crazy in 2007. It blew up. I saw billionaires basically go bankrupt overnight. It didn't make any sense. And then eventually I got swept up in the 2008 great financial crisis. And while it was like a tsunami, it was like this tidal wave that just came in and destroyed everything. And guys like myself who are producers, who are capitalists, because we've got to find capital to be able to produce projects, got wiped out because there was no capital. I was like flopping around on an empty, river that turned into a desert, and I was trying to carry my family on my back to safety, and there was nowhere to go. It was a desperate situation. One thing leads to another. I start pulling the threads, asking questions, and because I do what I do, I was able to put together a deal where I got, real money to be able to believe in what it was that I was searching for, and we found it. And what did we find? Well, ultimately, like I said at the beginning of this, let's just start with the Trump scenario, right? So our current special investigator for the Department of Justice, laid out that attorneys can lie on behalf of their client. It's called the criminal fraud exception, and it's illegal. And they can go to jail for that and lose their license. But here's the story. What I've been trying to tell you, millions upon millions of people have been destroyed by what we call foreclosure firms that use illegal documentation fraud to the tunes of millions. Remember when we were talking about what Michigan did with the 16 felony counts against the elector certifications for documentation fraud? Oh yeah, that's a crime. It's a felony, and they're going to go to prison unless they turn on Donald Trump, who was the ringleader, and it looks like that might be Giuliani, but on behalf of Trump. Okay, whatever, but it could become a racketeering situation. Oh yeah, by the way, in our investigation in the con at www.thecon.tv, because of a tragedy of an African-American woman who owned her house for decades, got basically through fraudulent paperwork, what we call straw buying, had her house stolen from her, and the sheriffs showed up at her door that were good guys, but they didn't understand what was going on and who they were working for, and they were just going through the process of foreclosure, but they were foreclosing on a wrong property that was, created through documentation fabrication, so that this woman who owned her own house basically got sacrificed because she wasn't going to go homeless, and so she committed suicide. But through her tragedy, we opened up this crazy Pandora's box, this crazy door to the ultimate revelation. We found the only RICO conviction of this crime in the entire country. And oh yeah, by the way, it's in the con at www.thecon.tv for a crime that buried at least 50 million Americans and tens of millions of people around the world through all sorts of grifts that we're seeing. And now I'll go to what Jack Smith in the special investigation is saying about, or I should say, Lawrence Tribe is saying about the credibility of Judge Eileen Cannon in the court. Oh yeah, he's impugning her integrity. Maybe she's working for a corrupt Republican Party and Trump who's trying to defraud the United States. Guess what happened in our situation? Thousands of judges, maybe tens of thousands, but at least thousands, worked with tens of millions of documents and looked the other way, did not allow discovery. And what we're telling you, that tens of millions of documentation fraud that were used in what we call liar's loans, which we show you in the con at www.thecon.tv, ended up liar securities to the tune of literally $600 to $800 trillion by 2006, 7, 8, okay? Based on all sorts of shit that happened behind the scenes through what we call deregulation that spanned from the late 90s. But ultimately, we're talking about a $4.6 trillion housing market that morphed into a $600 to $800 trillion fraud upon the world that was created by our financial system that we proved the only racketeering conviction in the entire country. And so moving forward with, again, I mentioned about the documentation fraud, and I talked about Jack Smith and the criminal fraud exception, and also whether or not the impugning of the integrity of the court. One of my friends, and a guy that I've grown to love and admire and respect, a guy who's a defense attorney who just had his bar license put on, basically trial, and they're going to take it from him. I guess he's on, what's it called for, 90 days where, he can't practice law, but it's destroying his family and everything else. And he went the distance, and he's got literally access to over 1 billion documents of data that were blown up by Bank of America, which, oh yeah, incidentally, has a special pipeline to Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Oh, go figure. And they've handpicked these judges in Florida to basically sit and rubber stamp documentation fraud and allowing attorneys to lie for their clients, which are the banks. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And that's what the government has allowed. And then moving forward into I could go on and I guess I'll just finish with the racketeering down in Florida. Look, again, racketeering is a conspiracy. There's got to take more than one person to pull this off. Now, the most interesting thing, and I think I said this at the outset of this Truth Bomb riff, but Jack Smith does not have to prove that Donald Trump was actually the brains behind the insurrection. Because anybody who knows anything knows that Donald Trump isn't the brains of anything. He's a jackass. He's a moron. He's about as dumb as it gets, but dumb like a fox. And like I've said many times in these Truth Bombs riffs, I need to, thank him for being the vector to prove to the tens of millions of you that I know aren't Nazis. I know there's a lot of MAGAs out there that are good people that are just pissed off of this rotting system, that maybe you had your job sold overseas, maybe you had your pension stolen, maybe you had your house stolen, and many, many of you have gone to Trump because he's fighting the system. Yeah, but he's fighting the system for himself. Donald Trump isn't somebody who doesn't want war for the sake of war. For all of you out there that are like, oh yeah, but at least he doesn't want us to have a war with Russia. Bullshit. He's taking the money wherever it comes from. If it was profitable for him to, have a war with Russia, he would. Not to mention the fact, but by the way, Jesus Christ, I'll talk about that just for a moment. Yeah, Russia's pipeline to Donald Trump wasn't all of this other stuff that, Matt Taibbi and Russell Brand and others have oh my God, there's no Russiagate because the Steele dossier was blown up and it was all made up by the Clinton Foundation and the FBI knew it and blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, Deutsche Bank was laundering billions of dollars for Russia into U.S. real estate, specifically Trump Tower. Oh my God, it's the easiest thing to see in the history of the world, not to mention everything else. So I'll finish with this. Look, guys, we spent $4.5 million to get the $29 trillion truth. So let's put this into perspective. This morning, I heard on Morning Joe, of all things, this guy, and I was just listening in because I was driving. I kind of hate, Morning Joe and Mrs. Brzezinski. She just drives me nuts, And in fact, I want to put this into perspective. I remember seeing years ago, there was an interview with this filmmaker named Charles Ferguson who did a fantastic movie called Inside Job, which was the first step to everything that I'm revealing to you. Matt Damon voiced it over before Matt Damon became Mr. Crypto Guy, and everything that reiterates or alludes or reflects. But ultimately, he was on an interview with Mika and her husband, and ultimately they and also one of the co-hosts at that time was none other than oh God, why can't I think of her name? She's the oldest, and I think she fell asleep on set. I want to say Diane Sawyer, but it's not. Why can't I think? You know what? I got to look it up real quick. Hold on a second. Hang out with me. I don't know why I'm having a brain freeze, but as soon as I say her, you'll get this. Oh yeah, Andrea Mitchell. Okay, so Andrea Mitchell and Joe and Mika are interviewing. They're interviewing Charles Ferguson, and Charles Ferguson. They're talking about the great financial crisis, and there's all of this chaos. And he just did the movie Inside Job, and Andrea Mitchell is sitting there across from him. She says, some of the things that you've said seem like they're, pushing the envelope and they're not that accurate, that sort of thing. And he's like, well, I can see how you could say that considering your husband was the centerpiece of it all. He was the former Federal Reserve Chairman, Alan Greenspan, who created all this madness that got us into this situation of which I think Donald Trump is the last act of this whole thing before the whole country explodes. But the bottom line is this congressman today said, hey, given everything that's going on with Trump in the aftermath and what it looks like Steve Bannon and Rudolph Giuliani were involved with in terms of getting fundraising from the big lie, and I know exactly where Donald Trump got the idea for the big lie, and he did it with Giuliani and Bannon because they all knew everything that I'm telling you. And by the way, I think they watched The Con, to be honest with you, because I think that's how they created this whole thing. I've just got a suspicion about that. But the long and the short of it is that this guy says, this congressman, he says, they raised $200 million based on this grift. This could be the largest conspiracy grift in history. 200 million is the largest. That wasn't a freaking day in 1 year of what Wall Street got away with for at least 2 decades. And ultimately, like I'm telling you, the con reveals to you the $29 trillion truth. That what we did was, because of this calamity, because we blew up the world, because we show you all of these things that Donald Trump did against the United States, that Wall Street did to us, that of course our government is hyper-focusing on Donald Trump. Ultimately, what we did behind the scenes was we enabled the Federal Reserve to use Federal Reserve Act 13.3, which is the lender of last resort capacity, to be able to provide 30 trillion. It's like 29 trillion, but 30 trillion is what the real number was in 2009 to this freaking bankrupt and financial corrupt system that destroyed millions of people. They got $30 trillion for freaking free when the statutes of Federal Reserve Act 13.3 as lender of last resort say you don't loan to insolvent banks, especially if they got bankrupted by their own fraud. Which is what we did, and nobody in media asked questions. And there was Charles Ferguson sitting across from Andrea Mitchell, whose husband was Greenspan, and they're like, yeah, so what's the point of that? Media has completely buried what I'm telling you, and they are like Donald Trump says, because he manipulates, because he knows and he's done it his whole career. Yeah, fake media. But they are telling the truth about Donald Trump's crimes. That's how insane this is. But we spent $4.5 million to get that truth, but we've got literally a whole system of machinery of lies that are obfuscating the truth that I'm telling you. Do I want Donald Trump to get away with this? No, I want to see Donald Trump tarred and feathered. He's a treasonous. I don't want to go that far. What are you supposed to do against somebody who's committed treason? You know what you're supposed to do and what they used to do. But the entire federal government is working for, and it's not of by and for the people. It's of by and for the corruption of the corruption of the corporations, and it's this fossil fuel, financial paradigm at the top of it, military-industrial complex, that from 9/11 forward, we've been living nothing but lies. What, did we go after Saudi Arabia after 9/11, or did we manufacture weapons of mass destruction? They get 20 years of war to do what exactly? Maintain fossil fuel. That's what we did, okay? All the stories of Saudi, who knows? But I can tell you, the Live Golf Tour, PGA, is all fine with it now that they're paying money and it's 20 years in the back door. Nobody's asked the questions. Where was that investigation? Oh, yeah, it was 9/11, and the guy who was the chair of it, Bob Graham, says it was all bullshit. And he's been trying to get the truth to the American people for 20 years. That's one side of it. How about the 2008 great financial crisis? Well, let me tell you something. We had the Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission. We had $250 billion of fines. We had the national mortgage settlement to the tune of $25 billion, all for what? Oh, we gave these guys $30 trillion and another $16 trillion of quantitative easing when we bought all of the manufactured product off of the books of the banks because the government gave the money to the banks to clean up. That led to all of this corruption where they bought the states and the judges and the sheriffs and everybody else to destroy millions of people. But now, a lot of those people are MAGAs. And they're like, they don't trust the institutions. And many of them are going so far as to become Nazis. My whole thing is corruption burrows and fuels fascism. We spent $4.5 million to get freaking destroyed, not out there. We couldn't get the information out to the people because I guarantee you the financial system cannot have this out there. To me, I can't believe it this many years later. But yeah, I've seen way too many things to make me realize this is how the whole thing works. And they were able to bury it. So that's why I come at you like over and over and over, screaming into a pillow off the mountaintops and everything else, that we have got to raise a tidal wave resurgence, populist crusade to purge corruption. And we got to raise money to do it because we're not going to do it violently. I don't want to do it violently. I want the truth out there, and we're not going to be able to take on the largest military in the world anyway, even if we wanted to, okay? We need everybody in the military and everybody else to realize that, yeah, you've gotten played. And by the way, to all of you sheriffs out there that were shaking hands with Donald Trump out on the tarmac when he's like doing this, tour, meanwhile he's indicted for defrauding the United States, I think all of you people should be, lose your badges and maybe be, charged with something, aiding and abetting. But the long and the short of it is, guys, how many people in the military are just like, the law doesn't matter. We want Donald Trump to be our autocrat, and we want to have the guns to oppress everybody else. Ooh. What would Black Lives Matter say about that one? Oh, yeah, it's a big problem. And on and on and on and on. So when you put the calculus together, we spent years, and I sacrificed my life And I literally lost everything that was important to me to get this truth to the American people. And I'm going all the way. And I need you to go with me. We need to get millions upon millions of you to join us to be able to, A, purge corruption, and B, destroy the fascism that it fuels. And the way we're going to do that is if millions of you invest $13, one time, $13, one time, $13. That's all I'm asking. But if you could go to 13 other people to get them in the mix to say, look, this guy Patrick Lovell's got the whole thing. Check out the con. It's free. www.thecon.free. TV. Let me slow down. www.thecon.tv. And then so on and so forth. And then ultimately, I guess my last point is that, for you to match us at $4.5 million, for what we've already done to get the $29 trillion truth, 347,000 of you would have to pony up $13. Hey man, I'm not standing on a street corner begging you for food, even though I love to give money to people when I can, because I tell you what, there's a lot of people who've fallen through the cracks that, don't know what's up. And once you go there and you're on the streets and you can't do anything because you're desperate, you're done. I'm talking to everybody else who doesn't want MAGA to win and doesn't want the corruption to win. Corruption births and fuels fascism. If you, me, and everyone you see who isn't a Nazi, who champions and believes in dignity, in decency, integrity, and sustainability and beauty, and if we merge in unity, we will defeat the misery of tyranny, because this whole thing is about creating a clean new deal. We've got the technology. Sound like the $6 million man here. We've got the technology to be able to build a world that makes sense, but you've got to have integrity of the system. And when it falls apart and when corruption takes over, chaos will happen. And I'm trying desperately to get tens of millions of you to join me, because if you pony up $13, we're going to create this 501c3. I'll continue to do what we do in terms of podcasts and everything else, but we got to build this groundswell, this ground game, where I take a multimedia tour that's like this, Lollapalooza, like, American barnstorming revival to every major city, culminating in Washington, D.C., with the truth that is going to free us from the burden of corruption. It's exodus from corruption and the revival, the redemption, the resurrection of the American dream. Jesus, did I say enough? Failure is not an option. Onwards and upwards. Rise, roar, revolt. Thanks for listening.